っているか。いるか。開始。ならば、始めましょうと。で、じゃあ、ダイリングテキスト。
There are a ton of CSS properties that affect the way text is displayed. I'm not going to attempt to cover every single one of them. Instead, we'll take a look at a few that illustrate the concepts behind their stylings. Let's jump.
もう一回。
There are a ton of CSS properties that affect the way text is displayed. I'm not going to attempt to cover every single one of them. Instead, we'll take a look at a few that illustrate the concepts behind their stylings. Let's jump straight into the code editor and take a look. Okay, so I'm in Sublime Text and I'm looking at the file called styling text before.html. Let me quickly rearrange the screen so you can see the browser and the code editor at the same time. Okay, so the first thing we want to do here is we have a class called style, and we're applying this class to the second paragraph in our HTML file. We have two paragraphs here. The second one is what we're applying this to. As you can see in the browser, there's a couple of paragraphs that are being shown, and both of them at the moment have the default styling from the browser. So our task here is to style the second paragraph just to see a comparison. So the first thing we want to do usually is specify font family. So font family is the property name, and the value for font family could vary. And in fact, I provided you here a link right straight in the HTML page, and we'll go ahead and click that link. It basically gives you commonly used font combinations. So what you usually put in the font family as the value is combinations of fonts. And the reason you put not just one font, but a few fonts is because when you specify font family in this way, you're relying on the client's computer, you're relying on the user's computer to have that font installed. And it's possible that a particular font will not be installed on the user's computer, so you want to provide some options, and at the very least you want to provide whether you want a serif type of font or a sans serif type of font, because every computer will have some sort of default serif or sans serif font. And just in case you don't know the difference between serif and sans serif, serifs are the fonts that not only have the lines but also have a bit of an embellishment at the end of each line. So as you can see, there's this little squigglies at the end of each line, as opposed to sans serif, they're just very straight lines. Personally, I prefer this particular font combination, so I'll copy it and paste it right here, give it a semicolon, and let's go back. Let's save the file and refresh. And now you see that now we have Arial, most probably, as the font for our paragraph. Next, let's change the color. Now you've seen me use color multiple times already, but the truth of the matter is, while it's probably okay to use red, green, blue, predefined color names in testing, for real websites, you would want to use a hexadecimal value for a particular color. And whatever color you want to have is something that obviously is up to you. So I'll pick this color, and this is a hexadecimal value, and the way this color is specified is the first two numbers is red, second two numbers is green, and the last two numbers is blue, FF being the highest blue value. So basically it's the same RGB specification that a lot of colors are specified as, except it's expressed in hexadecimal. So let's save it, refresh. As you can see now, it turned blue. Now, there are various shortcuts for specifying colors, and I'll let you look it up yourself, but needless to say, if you specify a 6-digit hexadecimal color, it's certainly good enough. The property font style is the one that specifies whether or not you want something to be italic or normal, and we'll give it an italic to just change it a little bit. We'll save it, refresh, and now you see the font turned italic. Next thing is font weight. Now, font weight could be specified from basically normal to bold. And you could also specify it using numbers. So if I specify all the way to 800, 900, and bold, well, 900 will be pretty bold. So if I save it and refresh it, it will be pretty bold. But in practice, people just use the word bold as a predefined keyword. So that's also good enough, and about equals 900 anyway. Next, we'll specify font size. And we'll give it a 24 pixels. And this will obviously give it a little bit of a bigger font size than it is right now, as you can see right there. Just about every browser out there has a default font size of 16 pixels. And that should give you an idea as to what an unstyled text would look like. And by unstyled, I mean the one that has the browser default styling applied to it. Now, don't confuse this with points. These are pixels. Points are used in print when you do Microsoft Word or something like that, but not on screen. On screen, you use pixels. Pixels are what's considered absolute unit of measurement for size. However, they do have a bit of a relative component to them. Pixels are relative to the viewing device. For low DPI or low dots per inch devices, 1 pixel is 1 device pixel dot of the display. For printers and high-resolution screens, 1 pixel implies multiple device pixels. Point is, higher DPI devices will give you sharper text because for every pixel that it's drawing, it's actually drawing multiple pixels on the device. With all that said, pixels is still considered an absolute unit of measurement. We'll talk about relative units of measurements as far as font size is concerned in just a little bit. But for this short segment, let me just show you a couple of more text properties that you might want to know about. There's another one called text transform, and it allows you to basically control how your text looks. Capitalize it, lower cases. If I capitalize, for example, save it and refresh, you could see that every word now gets capitalized. But there's more. There's lowercasing. I could have the entire text get lowercased, or I could get the entire text get uppercased. And let's leave it that way. Another useful property is text align. And what it allows you to do, it allows you to either center, right, justify, left the text within its block level element. For this one, let's go ahead and right justify it. Let's refresh, and here you go. We'll continue this lecture with part 2, and we'll speak about relative font sizing.
要するにこういういろんな方がありますよっていうぐらいだ。次。
Using CSS rule, a user of your website can do the same thing just by increasing the zoom. For example, here, I'll increase the zoom a couple of times. As you can see, I'm all the way to 200% zoom. And hopefully now you see the value of having relative units of measurements for font size. You can see that the visual size relationship between these different divs remains the same even though they're all now very big. This text is still half of this text, and this text is still half of this text.
Okay. ここで自動再生範囲の Point
number 2 is, even though we increased the font size here to 120 using CSS rule. Okay, let's talk a little bit about relative font sizing. And for that, we're going to take a look at font size before that HTML. And it's located in the same folder as the previous file. Now, there are 2 units of measurement that are relative that we're going to talk about, and that is percent and ems. Let's start with percent. First of all, let's specify that our body tag should have font size of 120%. And what that means is that we want to take whatever the default size is, and by default, I mean whatever the browser provides by default, and increase it by 120%. You can actually do a quick calculation and figure out what pixel size that would be. Most browsers have 16 pixels as default text size. So 120% of 16 would be a little bit over 19 pixels. So if we refresh the page, we'll see that we increased the font size in the entire HTML document. Let's now target the very first text here that says 2M text. So let's go ahead and actually use an inline style since we're just testing, and specify the font size to be 2M. And M is a unit of measurement that is equivalent to the width of the letter M in this particular font that we're using. It sounds a little bit confusing at first, but the bottom line is it's a relative size. It's relative to something. And for this div where it says 2M text, what this is saying is it's relative to whatever the font size is at the moment we're applying it. Since we set the font size to 120% in the entire body, this div also received that 120%. And when you combine this font size with this one, this basically says I want to increase the font 2 times of whatever 120 was. So if we take a look at this text, this 2M text should really increase twice as large as this word regular text. So if we save the file and refresh, and you can see now everything, since that div includes the other divs, they got increased. That looks just about right, that it's twice the size of the regular text. Now you might find this confusing. Didn't we just override the font size and say it's 2M? Why is 120% playing together with 2M instead of having 2M override the 120%? And that's kind of the game of the relative sizing. When you specify them on subsequent elements, they don't have an overriding effect, they have a cumulative effect instead. Because what you're saying here is, whatever the size of this div is, I want you to increase it, or I want you to make 2M's out of it, meaning make it twice as large. So I'm sure you guessed now, how do I make this 4M text actually 4M? If I specify style and say font size, what should I put here? Should I put 4M? Well, that would be a mistake. If I put 4M, it will really be the 2M that's already applying to this times 4M, which would make it 8M. Right? But what we actually need to do is put 4M. In order to do that, I just specify 2M again. So it means that this 4M text will be twice as large as the 2M text right here. So let's save the file and refresh. And you can see now it's twice as large and this 2M. This text also got caught into this because it is a child element of our div that we just styled. So how do I make it 2M again? Well, the answer is you don't overwrite it, you just decrease it. So let's go ahead and say style, font size, and in order to get back to 2M, I need to half the size of my text. So in order to do that, I'll just say 0.5M, and now when I refresh, my text now is back to the same size as it was before because I halved the relative size of 4M. Couple of more quick points before we finish up. First, it's a pretty common practice that if you want to increase the font size in the entire document, that you specify percentage and you apply it usually to the most parent tag, which is usually the body tag. And technically speaking, you could have continued to use percentages even here. So 2M really translates to 200%. So if I put 200% right here and save it and refresh, you can see nothing really changed. However, it's more common to use M's when you're talking about relative sizes within the document itself. But one thing you should know is that even though you could use percentages here, I highly recommend you don't mix and match the percentage M's and certainly not the absolute value units all over the place. It could get very confusing and it'll become a mess. So it's better to keep things consistent. Point number 2 is, even though we increased the font size here to 120, using CSS rule, a user of your website can do the same thing just by increasing the zoom. For example, here, I'll increase the zoom a couple of times. As you can see, I'm all the way to 200% zoom. And hopefully now you see the value of having relative units of measurements for font size. You could see that the visual size relationship between these different divs remains the same even though they're all now very big. This text is still half of this text, and this text is still half of this text.
またか。オープンブラウザーで見ていいね。あ、消してるか。いつもやだ。あ リアリーレコードコムっていうのが、サインアップしてくれって言ってるのは、まあ宣伝ですね。この教授というか、この講師が使ってるサービスなので、サインアップしてくれと宣伝してます。プラクティスクリア。budget is millions of Yes。季節は画面サイズなのですから。これはトゥルー。今のフレンが 1M Its body 130px。3em。That's a exercise of text how big am I は、assuming the user didn't increase zoom in the browser window。30px。ノーマルが30ってその3倍だからか。90px と。で、ボックスモデル。
In HTML, every element is considered a box. However, there's more to that box than just the content that the element wraps around. Let's take a quick look at a simple diagram. Besides the actual content, each box consists of padding, border, as well as margins. The box model refers to the components that make up an HTML box, as well as the rules that govern how these box components affect the layout, as well as how width and height of the box are calculated. Let's jump into the code and take a look at some examples. Okay, so here I am in Sublime Text, and I'm looking at the file called boxmodel.before.html, and it's located in the examples lecture 19 folder. Let's quickly examine the HTML structure of this document. It's actually pretty simple. It just has one h1 here, has a div that has an ID box, and inside of that div there's another div with an ID content, and it has some lorem ipsum, basically some dummy text in it. In addition to that, I colored the box itself with a background color blue, and the content, which is that div right here, this content, I colored it with this color, which is basically light green. And just so we have some more interesting colors in the background, I colored the body to be gray. Okay, so here's the representation of our page in the browser. And since div is a block level element, it tries to fill in the entire parent in terms of width. So it's trying to fill up the entire width here in the browser. But there's something strange going on if you take a look. There's some space that's going on here right before lorem, and here at the end of our content, the beginning and there's spacing going on. So let's take a look at the Chrome developer tools real quick and figure out what that space is about. Okay, so we'll go ahead and choose the box. That's our box. And we'll take a look as to what's going on. There doesn't seem to be any spacing that's set on the box itself. Well, how about the body itself? And the body tag. Oh, and here we go. See, we realize that the body tag here has a margin all around of 8 pixels. Now, where is that 8 pixel coming from? Well, if you take a look here, it's telling you where it's coming from. It's coming from the user agent style sheet, which means it's the browser itself. It's the default browser styles. So that's actually pretty common that the browsers do stuff like that. And what we're going to do is, in order for it not to affect what we're doing, we're going to reset it. And there's actually resets on the web out there, plenty of resets on the web, how to reset default browser settings. So we'll go ahead and do margin 0. And we'll also do padding 0, so we won't be affected by any of that. And when we do that, when we save and refresh, you see that now our content is flush with the actual borders of the browser window. Okay, so moving on, so we have our content, and you can see the content is green. Now, we're not seeing the background of the box the content is actually sitting in, because we would have seen something blue in the background, and all we see is green. And that is because the inner box, the inner content div, is covering up the outer one completely, because they are the same size. They both try to fill up their parent, which is in this case the body tag. They both try to fill it up all the way, and since this one basically is sitting on top or inside of this one, it's covering up the blue background. Let's go ahead and set some padding on our box. Let's do padding, and we'll do 10 pixels top, 10 pixels right, 10 pixels bottom, and 10 pixels left. Now we set that, and by the way, there's obviously a shortcut for this. You could actually remove all these 10 pixels right here, and that would mean exactly the same thing. And I'll let you actually look up as to all the different shortcuts you could take, but I'll leave this here for now. So point is, it always goes top, right, bottom, left. And let's go ahead and save that and refresh the browser. And voila, now we're seeing the padding. And what the padding is doing is basically giving some padding around our content. And our content being this div tag right here with the content text is the one that's being kind of squeezed all around, and the padding is showing up all around. And now you can see the blue because that's the background color of our box. Okay, so next, let's give our box some border. Let's go ahead and say border. And we'll give it a border that's going to be 3 pixels thick, and it's going to be solid as opposed to dashed or something like that. And there's other options here you could welcome to look up. And we want to give it the color black. Okay, when we save that and we refresh the browser, we could see that the border showed up as well. In fact, let's make it a little bit thicker. Let's make it 5 pixels border, and let's make it right like that. Okay, and then last but not least, let's give it some margins as well. Let's go to margin, and let's go ahead and use the shortcut notation, which is giving 40 pixels, which means I'm saying I want 40 pixels all around. So top, right, bottom, and left. So if I go ahead and refresh that, you could see now there's 40 pixels on every side, or you could see it on the bottom per se, and you can't really necessarily see it here, but there's 40 pixels on every side. Okay, well, up until now, we sort of let the content and some of our margins and so on dictate how big the actual box is. But what about if we actually set its width ourselves? Let's go ahead and set its width to be, let's say, 300 pixels. When we save and refresh, we see the box now became smaller. But let's go ahead and examine this box. Let's go ahead and click on it inside Chrome Developer Tools, and let's take a look. So it's showing us that our box is in fact 300 pixels wide, and since we didn't restrain our height, it went ahead and wrapped around the text, and basically the height will adjust unless we restrain it manually by specifying the height. It will adjust to however much it needs to fit. So if we make it a little bit smaller, let's make it, let's say 100 pixels, and we'll refresh, you'll see the height will become a little bit bigger. The height will become 72 because now we squeezed it enough that extra lines got added. So now the content width is 100, but the height is larger. So let's go ahead and put it back to 300 and refresh. And now if you look at this breakdown, we come to our first pretty interesting point. Well, first of all, let's go through all the components. Here, this one is the pure content right here that I'm mousing over right here. And then if I go out a little bit, it will highlight for me in the browser the padding that's going on there. And if I go out a little bit more, I'll go straight onto the border, right? And if you can't really see the margins, if you roll over to the margin side, voila, now you see what the margin is going. And even though to the right side it's showing you a little bit more than really the margin is going on, but the 40 pixels all around still stands. Now, what's interesting to find out is, well, how big is this box exactly? As we're going to start putting more and more boxes, right, we're going to start making layouts of different HTML components, and to get our UI just right, we need to find out how big is each box. Well, we sort of specified that we want the box to be 300 pixels wide. The problem is that it's not really 300 pixels wide. Let's take a look. If we take a look here, it says 300 pixels wide, but we're forgetting that there's a border around it, or the padding around it, and the padding is 10 pixels on one side and 10 pixels on the other side. But that's not all. There's also a border around it as well that is 5 pixels wide and 5 pixels wide on this side. So really it's 300 plus 10 plus 10, that's 20, 320, plus 5 plus 5, that's 330. So if you look at the actual visible border of this distance is not actually 300, this distance is 330. And the interesting part is, or kind of annoying part is that depending on what border and padding you set, this width will change. So let's take a look. Let's say if I make the border something really crazy like 20 pixels and go ahead and refresh, I'll take a look. Now the border is 20 pixels, so now my box ends all the way there. Right? And if I make the padding even bigger, let's say I make the padding, and this one is the right. So I make the padding 30, and on the left I make the padding 30 as well. And I take a look at the box. Take a look how it's going to, whoa, it became bigger again. So even though we said I want the width of the box to be 300, it turns out that we aren't really setting the width of the box. We're actually setting the width of the content, and that's this piece right here in the green. Well, it turns out for layouts and just in general sanity, this is kind of annoying. You really want to change that. And CSS3 actually did change that. It turns out that by default, the box sizing is actually a property of every HTML element. And by default, it's actually set to content box, which means when you specify its height and width, you're specifying the height and width of the content box, not the entire thing. Well, CSS3 came out with a new value for that property, and that's called border box. Let's go ahead and set that right here. We'll say box sizing, not shadow sizing, and we'll say border box. And when we refresh, let's take a look. Look at that. It became smaller. So now if you take a look at the breakdown, you can see that even though we specified the width to be 300, well, that width is guaranteed to be the width of this box right here from the beginning, the edge of this border to the edge of this border. So if you take a look here, 200 plus 30 plus 30, that's 260, plus 20 plus 20, that's another 40, that's 300. And if we change it back to content box, which is the default, it will jump back to its original size. But the truth of the matter is, all the modern frameworks like Bootstrap and others use border box as its sizing model. And as you plan and work with your layouts, this is the same choice to make. So make sure you always stay with the box sizing of border box.
複数サイズの指定をしとくと、一番安全ってことやな。
Okay, so in the previous segment, we spoke about the fact that you should always try to use box sizing border box as your box sizing model. Now, of course, you don't want to specify box sizing border box on every element in your entire HTML, so you definitely want to specify it once and then have it be inherited everywhere. So let's go ahead and try to do that. Let's remove this border box from here, and body seems to be like a natural place to put it, since body is the top level element and it should inherit everywhere else. So if I place the box sizing border box here and then I refresh, this should stay the same. Oop, it didn't work. Now, why didn't that work? It jumped back to the content box. Well, the reason that didn't work is because box sizing is one of those CSS properties that is not inherited. You can't set it on its on a parent element and then expect that the child elements will inherit that property. So how do we get around that? Well, the way we get around it is by learning about one more selector. And that selector is the star selector. Let's go back up here and we'll go ahead and say star, and then we'll cut and paste that border box property right here. Now, what is this star do? First of all, let's refresh to see if it worked. And sure enough, now it's working. What star does, star selector says, is go ahead and select every element there is and apply these particular CSS properties to them. The difference between star and placing some property in a parent element, for example, is that star says, I am not asking you to inherit anything. I'm saying select every element, which means it's as if it took this property and this value, and then it went to the HTML and then applied it to every element it saw. It applied that particular property and value, which in this case is box sizing border box. So that's how properties like box sizing are applied across your entire page. Now, I told you that border box is a property that's new in CSS3. Whenever you hear something like that, an alarm bell should go off. Does every browser that I deal with support border box? Well, we know just the resource to check that out, and we'll go to the website called caniuse.com, and we'll type in border box. Border box is a CSS3 box sizing property, and if we take a look, excellent. Every single browser is green. So every single browser fully supports this property value. Okay, so next, let's close this up, and let's try to advance our margin understanding a little bit better. Okay, so let's take a look at this diagram. We have two boxes next to each other, in other words, two elements, and the gray part is the margins. Well, margins that are left and right are cumulative. So if I have a margin, right margin of 40 pixels on the left box, and a left margin of 50 pixels on the right box, the cumulative margin will be 90 pixels, 40 plus 50. And that's pretty simple, and this is exactly what you would expect. But what happens if you have one element on top of the other element, which is, let's say these are two divs, and each one is specifying a margin. So one is specifying margin of 30, margin top for the bottom element, margin top is 30, and for the top element, margin bottom is 20. Would you expect this to be 50 pixels? The cumulative? Well, the answer is it won't be. The answer is the margins collapse and the larger margin wins. So the actual distance between the border of one element and the border of another element will be, in this case, 30 pixels, meaning the larger margin will win and the other one will just collapse. Let's take a look at an example inside our code editor. Okay, so going back to the same file, boxmodel before.html, we can take a look and see that we have H1 here, and we defined a margin bottom of 30 pixels on H1. Let's go ahead and go to our box and actually remove the margin altogether and refresh, and we'll take a look what it is without the margin. So you can see there's just some margin going on here, and that margin is coming from this H1 here, margin bottom. Let's go ahead and define a margin top. So we need a margin bottom is on H1 here, and we need a margin top on our box. So let's define a margin top of 20 pixels. And when we do that, when we refresh, absolutely nothing will happen. And the reason that is because the box is defining a 20 pixel margin, yet the H1 is already defining a 30 pixel margin. So when they come together and touch, they collapse into whatever the larger margin is. So in this case, that's 30. However, if I made the margin to be 40, let's say even 50 pixels, now you'll see that the box will move down because now the box has a larger margin than the one specified on H1. So there is now a bigger distance between the box model H1 and the actual box, and it's actually 50 pixels. We can also notice, by the way, that the box model, the words box model, are not flush at the top with the corner of the browser. Now, why is that? Let's go and investigate. Let's go ahead and inspect the element. Let's take a look. It's got a margin of 21.4 something. And where's this margin coming from? Well, it's coming from, again, the user agent style sheet. And the reason it's coming here is because of some browser-specific prefixes that we actually haven't talked about that are defining the margin before and margin after. We're not going to delve too much into this, but the bottom line, it means before the element and after the element, they'll define some margin. Now, the reason our margin on the body that we specified, margin 0, is not working here is very simple. Body says anything that is below me and inside of me, right, is going to have the margin inherited. But that's only if you don't override it specifically for that element. As you see here, user agent style sheet has a selector H1 that is specifically overriding the margin, which therefore wins. And this is a bit of a side point, but how do we override this? Well, now that we know about the star selector, it's easy. You could just say and move the padding and the margin to the star selector, and now what this basically saying is that I am selecting every element specifically, and then I'm overriding its margin. So if I refresh the page now, you could see now it's flushed together to the top. We won't necessarily be doing this in our pages left and right, but at least now you know that if you wanted to reset, and it's called CSS resetting, if you wanted to reset the CSS browser defaults, you would do this most of the time using the star selector.
今のでリセットして説の例ができたわけか。
Okay, one more small topic before we finish this lecture. We spoke before about box sizing. So specifying the size of the box, and we talked about box sizing being the border box, meaning that if I specify some width or some height, it will always include from the edge of the border to the other edge of the border. And we also showed that as we change the width of our element, since the content inside the box shifted, the height of the box shifted as well. So let's go ahead and add some more content into our box, and we'll use the Emmet plugin, E-M-M-E-T. Go ahead and look it up. We'll save it. We'll refresh it, and now we see it's much bigger than before. Let's lower this a little bit so you could see. So because I added extra content, you could see that the height of our element is now 162. Now, but what happens if I constrain our element's height as well? Something is going to have to give, right? Because there's just no space left. So let's adjust a couple of things. First of all, let's go ahead and make this back to 10. So the padding will be just 10 all around. And the border is kind of looking unseemly. So we'll make it like 5 pixels. And go ahead, and the margin doesn't matter now. So let's refresh, and now it's a little bit better. Okay, so let's go ahead and now give it a height that will clearly not be able to fit all the content of our box. So let's give it a height of, let's say, 50 pixels, and we'll save and refresh. As you can see, what's happening now is that our content spilled over outside of our box. And if we actually place some element right below it, let's go ahead and place another div, and we'll say again lorem ipsum here. And we'll save and we'll refresh. You could see it's spilling over right over the other content. So it's basically spilling over out of the box. Let's go ahead and remove that for a minute. Okay, so how do we deal with this? Well, there's a couple of ways of dealing with it. And there's just a property to help us do that. And the property is called overflow. So we are overflowing at the moment. We are overflowing our content outside of the box. So what should we do with that overflow? So by default, the overflow is visible. And this is exactly what's going on. So if I save this and refresh this again, it's the same thing. However, there's a couple more options we could do. Number one is we could just clip it. So in order to clip it, we could say, go ahead and have it hidden. So if it's hidden, then if we refresh, it'll just go ahead and clip it where the box ends. However, there's a couple more options we could do. We could say auto. Auto means go ahead and put scroll bars wherever they're needed in order for us to look at the entire content. So let's go ahead and refresh that. You can see I have a scroll bar here, and I can now scroll through my entire content right inside that box. If I wanted to, I could keep the scroll gutters always visible, no matter whether or not I need them or not, by just saying scroll as the property value. If I refresh, now I have scroll both ways, even though there's nothing to scroll here, but I could still scroll up and down. Let's go ahead and change it back to auto and refresh. Okay, so now we have the scroll bar just where we need it. While this is a perfectly acceptable solution to get your content inside the available space that you have, I will warn you that users absolutely hate double scrolling. Having a scroll bar on the side of the browser plus having to scroll inside some element is something that is not preferred. However, there are cases where it's perfectly normal and expected to do. For example, if you're looking through, let's say, terms of service, and you just really want to pack in your entire UI into one visible chunk, yet you want them to be able to scroll through some terms of service or something like that, or some other content. A solution for your overflow being auto is certainly an acceptable one. Okay, so in summary, we spoke about the box model, and really the box model is this very essential topic to understand about CSS, and as we go on to CSS layouts. We talked about the fact that you should prefer to use box sizing border box, and that will keep things consistent for you as you change the border and the padding properties. We spoke about the universal selector, the star selector, and how it can affect every single element in the entire HTML page. And we also spoke about cumulative and collapsing margins. Remember, horizontal margins are cumulative, and for the most part, in most circumstances, the vertical ones collapse. We also spoke about the cases where the content overflows the size of the actual box, and what do we do about it using the overflow property. Next, we're going to talk about the background property.
課題の開始。のアダーで、ボーダーは、プラス、マージンそうだから、未伝にあるぞ、邪魔だ。9の10の10だから40だね。ボーダースタイルの場合は、ボーダーボックスの場合は、ボーダーとパティが中に入るから、いうことになる。Yes。これはマージンコラプスが発生して、大きい方の 20px が残ると。2週目だからもう遅れてるのよね。
Up until now, we've been using the background property just to set the background color. But the truth is, there's many more properties we could set. So let's jump into the code editor and take a look. Okay, so here I'm in Sublime Text, and I'm looking at the file called background.before.html, and it's located in the examples lecture 20 folder. And the structure of this HTML document is pretty simple. We have the h1 just to basically tell us what the title of this whole thing is and be visible. And we have the div with an ID called bg, and the content just says background properties are fun. And the bg is styled with an ID selector, and width being 500 and height being 500. So if we resize our editor a little bit and expose the browser, so we see that's basically the page that's being represented. Let's go ahead and close the sidebar. Okay, and let's do what we have done previously, which is set the background color of this element. And let's set it to blue. And if we refresh the page, we see that we have 500 by 500 pixels square that we've created. So having a background as a color, as a solid color, is nice, but what if we wanted an image as a background color? Well, there's a property to take care of that, and the property is called background-image. And if we do that, we could supply a URL with parentheses, and inside there, and it's best practice just to put it in quotation marks, you could specify a file. So let me take a look here at my file explorer here, and I see I have yakov.png, and if we take a look at it, yes, that's a caricature of me, and so I want to display that as the background, is a background image. So I'll specify yakov.png right here. Now, before we go on, notice that the URL that you specify right here, let me close this real quick. In fact, let me open it back up and make this bigger a little bit. Notice that the URL that you supply is a relative URL, but it has to be relative to your CSS. So if this CSS that we're writing, which is right now, we're just writing inside the style tag, but if we were to put it inside of a subfolder like CSS or style subfolder, the URL would be different. The URL would have to be relative to the CSS file, or actually, to be very technically correct, the URL would have to be relative to the way the CSS file is served in the browser. So slash something something, that's the URL that it would need to be relative to. So let's go back to the browser, and we'll close up the sidebar, save this, and let's reload this. And voila, we have our background image, and you can see that it's being repeated. And that's actually yet another property that you could set. So let's go ahead and put a semicolon here and say background repeat. And here we have a few options. We have no repeat, repeat X, repeat Y. So if we do repeat X, well, as a repeat Y, what it's going to do is it's just going to repeat it vertically. Or we could just say no repeat. And no repeat, we'll just put one image in the top left corner by default. Also notice that we're using a background color property and a background image property at the same time, and you can see that the image wins in terms of priority. It is on top of the color. We can also specify the position of the image within the element. So let's go ahead and do that right now. We'll say background position, and we'll give it two values. First is a horizontal value and then the vertical value. So let's say we want it to be top and right. If we save that and refresh, now we're top and right. Oh, let's make it a little bit more interesting. Bottom and right. Now specifying only one of these will make the other one default to center. So if I just specify right and refresh, you'll see that it's now vertically in the center. And similarly, if I specify bottom and refresh, you'll see it'll be at the bottom, but horizontally now it will be in the center. So these properties, background color, background image, repeat, and so on, they're all individual properties. But the truth is you could combine them all into one. And let's go ahead and do that now. Let's go ahead and erase this and specify just the background. And if you specify just the background, you can now list these same properties right here without having to specify them one by one. Here I'll specify my background image. I'll specify that I don't want it to be repeated, no repeat. And I can also specify its location. So let's say I want it to be right and center. If I save that and refresh, you can see that my image did move to the right and it's in the center. Now, something strange though happened, right? I mean, where did the color blue disappear to? I thought it was both. We could have both the color blue and at the same time have a background image. When the reason it disappeared is because my background property is being specified after the background color property. And since I chose to use the background without the dash for a particular property, it's overriding every single property except the ones that I'm actually specifying. So if I wanted to, I could go ahead and say blue and refresh, and my blue is back. So the point is, if you specify background color specifically, and then you go ahead and override it with the background, but you don't specify the color, or you don't specify whatever the specific property is, whether it's background image or background repeat or background position and so on. If you went ahead then and specified background without any dash sub property, whatever properties that are inherited with a dash will be overridden unless you actually call them out directly straight in the background property. Okay, so to summarize, we spoke about the background property in its sub-properties, image, color, position, etc. And the background property can be pretty simple, but it can also get pretty complex, and it's used for adjusting image size and resolution based on screen size. Now, I know we haven't seen that because we haven't seen media queries yet, but we will in just a few lectures. Next, we're going to talk about positioning elements by floating.
30分。こうやって課題の解説。リプスでバックグラウンドはブルー、バックグラウンド URL。ジャストイメージだけだよね。バックグラウンドで全部消しちゃうから、動物でやる。この間ちょっと見て。
In this lecture, we're going to talk about positioning elements by floating them. Now, knowing how to properly float elements is an essential skill to have. And this is partially because most of the UIs today, web UIs today that are made by floating the elements. In fact, by the end of this lecture, we're going to create a two-column flexible design where the columns will be flexible as we expand and contract the browser. So let's jump into the code editor and see how this works. Okay, so here we are in Sublime Text, and we're looking at the file named floatingbefore.html. And let's go over the structure of this HTML document real quick. We have our regular H1 here, just to announce what that is. And then we have a div with 4 paragraph tags and a section tag with some text in it. And the paragraph tags are ID'd P1, P2, P3, and P4. If you look at our div section, we styled the div tag, its background, to be a certain color, basically a light bluish color. And every single paragraph tag was styled to be 50 pixels wide and 50 pixels tall, and we gave it a nice 1 pixel border. And just to differentiate between each paragraph box, we gave it a different background color to each one. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this looks like in the browser. Okay, so here are the 4 paragraph boxes that we had. Okay, so let's go ahead and float the very first paragraph box to the right. We'll say float right, and we'll go ahead and refresh the page. And you see that the box jumped all the way to the right top edge of the containing element. Now, a couple of quick things to notice right away. First is that you could see that the rest of them moved up as if the maroon box isn't there anymore. And the reason this is happening is because when you float elements, the browser takes them out of the regular document flow. And this is why the second paragraph box moves in to the original spot of the first one, because as far as the regular document flow is concerned, that spot became empty. Second thing to notice is that even though each one of these paragraph boxes has a margin around them, as you can see that there's a margin between each one of them right here, that margin collapses, as we've learned before, when it is touching the margin of another element. However, when it comes to floated elements, the margins never collapse. And this is why you're now seeing the margin around the element on top. Also, if you paid close attention, you will notice that the light blue box, the div element, became shorter. To really illustrate what's going on, let's go ahead and remove the float right and instead make every single paragraph box float to the left. And to ensure that the boxes aren't squished right against the other, let's go ahead and give it a margin right of, let's say, 10 pixels. Let's go ahead and refresh the page. And you can see that now they're all floated to the left and there's a 10 pixel margin between them. However, what happened to our div? Our div seemed to have completely collapsed, and the only thing that's really keeping it open at all is the text that we put in here. This is happening because of the same point that I made before. When you float elements, it takes them out of the regular document flow. Therefore, it collapses in height and surrounds the last section element, which has actually some text in it. In order to correct it, we need to tell the browser that when it comes to this section element, the browser should resume the regular document flow. And the way that we do that is by using the clear property. So let's go ahead and go to our styling and define section target, and we say clear left. And what this is doing is telling the browser that the section element is announcing that nothing should be allowed to be floating to the left of it. And since every single paragraph that we've been floating is flowing to the left, when we save it and refresh, this should jump right below here, and so it does. And this is not restricted to the non-floated elements. We can ask a floated element to resume its regular document flow and then float it again. So for example, the reason this box is situated right here is because there's something already floated to the left of it. But if I tell the browser to go ahead and resume the regular document flow on it, it should jump to the next line and then resume floating from there on. So that's box number 3. So let's go ahead and go over here and say clear, and since things are floated to the left of the box, we're going to say clear left. So nothing should be allowed to float to the left of it. When we save and refresh, you can now see that box number 3 moved on its own line again and is floated to the left again. There's one more value of the clear property that I should explain before we move on to try to create our 2-column layout. And that value is both. So you could say clear both. So let me show you a circumstance where that would actually apply. We're going to reset our page back to the way it was, and we'll go ahead and remove the floating elements here. And we'll refresh. So this is how it was when we started. So let's go ahead and float the first element to the left as we did before. And we'll float the second box to the right. Okay, so now if we refresh the browser, you could see that both boxes floated, and you could see the other two kind of moved into their places. So we already know how to deal with that. In order to move them to the next line, we can just say clear, and now we need to clear what? Now there's a box floating to the left, and there's a box floating to the right. So we can't say clear right. And when we refresh the browser, this will go on its own line. However, we could equally say clear left, because there's a box that is on the left as well. So it seems like in this particular circumstance, it doesn't make any difference whether you say left or right. However, it will make a difference if I make the right box much taller than it is now. So I'll go ahead and go to box number 2, and I'll make its height something much taller, let's say 300 pixels. And when I refresh the page, you could see that it really went all the way down, and it's totally ignoring the fact that I want to clear this element, meaning I want it really on the next line by itself. And the reason that's happening is because I'm actually clearing this element only from the left floating elements, but I'm not clearing it from the right floating elements. So therefore, if I wanted to, I could say here clear right again, and when I refresh, it will jump all the way down. But the problem is that what happens when this element becomes too tall? Well, then it'll start overlapping again, right? So if I make this element, let's make this a little bit less, let's make it 100, and when we refresh, you can see now it's still not overlapping because we're clearing to the right. But let's now make element number 1 taller. Let's make its height, let's say 150 pixels, and refresh. And you can see now it's overlapping. So in order to ensure that both columns, or both left and right floated elements, are not encroaching on our space here of the third element, we could just say clear both. And refresh, you can see that no matter which one is going to be taller, it will still insist that nothing should be floated to its left or to its right, and therefore it will be on its own line. Okay, so let's go ahead and try to achieve that 2-column layout design. And in order to do that, we're going to take a look at a file called 2columnbefore.html, and it's located in the same folder, examples lecture 21. And the HTML structure is basically very similar to the file we just looked at. The differences here is that I only have 2 paragraph tags inside that div. I removed the other 2, and we still have a section tag inside of it. And what we want to achieve is that this first paragraph should be the left column and the second paragraph should be the right column. So let's see what we did here. So first of all, for now, we're keeping the background colors of all the elements. And on the paragraph tag, we said the width, and the width we did something different this time. We didn't specify pixels, we specified percent. So we're saying the width should be 50% of its containing element. And the containing element is the div. Well, the div is a block level element, so it tries to fill in the entire width of its containing element, which is the body or the entire browser. So basically what we're saying is that a paragraph should take 50% of the entire viewport. We also gave it a 1 pixel border, and we floated each one of them to the left. So let's go ahead and take a look at the browser to see what this turned out to be. And looking at the browser, not quite exactly what we wanted. The second paragraph is still on the bottom. Why is this happening? Well, the reason this is happening is because we're still using the default box sizing, which is content box. And then we're saying that we want the box to take 50% of the screen, and then we're adding that 1 pixel over there. That really breaks the whole thing. So if we remove that pixel right here and refresh the browser, now it's floating exactly how we want it. Oh, and by the way, this is a great illustration of what happens to floated elements when they can't fit on the same line. And what happens is they float to the next line. And this is actually what happened when we had the border pushing the size of the box a little bit too much that it didn't fit on the same line anymore. However, for now, we do want the border, and if we get the border, then we can't have the floating. So how do we fix this? Well, hopefully you still remember how to reset the box sizing, and the box sizing we're going to say is border box. And once we do that, the border will be included in the 50% of the width. So now we save the file, we'll go ahead and refresh, and now we see even with the border, we can have both of them floating side by side. Let's enhance our layout a little bit by giving some padding to the content inside each paragraph. So let's say padding, let's give it 10 pixels all around. Let's refresh, and we could see now we have the content separated from its border a little bit better. And finally, we can actually remove all these background colors and the border because they were only there to help us visualize things. So we're going to go ahead and comment them out. We'll go ahead and refresh, and now we see we have a 2-column layout. Let's make this a little bit bigger. And as you can see now, the layouts have a 2-column layout, and as I squeeze the browser, the 2-column layout stays, and not only that, they're flexible. And the reason they're flexible is because we didn't specify them with a particular pixel size, we specify them as a percentage of its container element. So in summary, floating elements can produce very flexible layouts. Floats are taken out of their normal document flow, and they're positioned at the top left or right edge of the containing element. Also, floats don't have vertical margin collapse, so previously hidden or collapsed margins will show up once you float the element. And remember that to resume normal document flow, use the clear property. Either clear left, clear right, or clear both. Next, we're going to talk about relative and absolute element positioning.
Please. them out of the regular document is 名前の通り浮かせるから、The following code section clearize. That must crystal elements should allow agent. 違う。Says that none of the section elements should. これスロッティだとキャッチする。false。かな。こっちは true でいいのか。こっちも。もう一回。こっちは当然 true で、でも true. Says that none of the section elements should allow anything to float to the right of the. よいしょ。これで合格。
Previously, we spoke about one type of alternative element positioning, and that's floating elements. I say alternative because it is alternative to the normal document flow. In this lecture, we're going to speak about a couple of more positioning schemes, and that's relative and absolute. These positioning schemes allow you to specify precise offsets to move the target element to a different part of the page or region. First, let's talk about static positioning. Static positioning is basically a different way of saying normal document flow. It is actually a default setting for all elements except HTML. And if you try to apply positioning offsets on elements whose position property is set to static, the offsets are just ignored. A different type of positioning scheme is called relative positioning. When you apply position relative on an element, the element is positioned relative to its position in the normal document flow. In other words, if you were to apply offsets on that element, they will be offset from the original normal document flow position of that element. So the positioning CSS offset properties are top, bottom, left, and right. So when you position an element as relative, you're basically creating like an anchor for the offset. So the element's top, bottom, left, and right edges become the boundaries from which you offset the element. The important thing to know about relative positioning is that the element that is set to relative positioning is not taken out of normal document flow. In fact, even if it's moved by using the offsets, its original spot is preserved. So as far as the rest of the HTML elements and the rest of the HTML page is concerned, that element is still sitting in its original spot, even though visually it's offset somewhere else. So let's give a quick visual example. So here's the paragraph, and it's basically represented by this orange box. As soon as we set position relative on the element, its edges become almost like an anchor for future offsets. Now, when we apply the offsets, the element moves relatively to its original position in the normal document flow. So in this case, it's moving top 50 pixels and left 50 pixels. Now, these values might be a little bit confusing since we're saying left 50 pixels, but yet we're moving the element to the right. So the way you could think about these offsets is really not top or left, but more like from the top and from left. So if you take from left 50 pixels, you move 50 pixels to the right, and you take from top 50 pixels, you're really moving 50 pixels from the top. Also note that nothing really changed about the document other than this element moving. The original space for that element still remains, and the originally laid out elements around that element still remain exactly the same because they think the element is still sitting in its original spot. You can also use negative values for these offsets, and which one you use, bottom right or top left, it's really more of a convenience for you depending on the use case you're trying to code to. So in this example, we achieved the same result by using negative bottom right values as we did by using positive top and left values. Now, the idea of the absolute positioning is that all offsets, top, bottom, left, right, are all relative to the position of the nearest ancestor which has positioning set on it other than static. In other words, some parent, grandparent, or on and on ancestor has to have its positioning set other than static, and then the absolute positioning will actually start working. By default, HTML element is the only element that has non-static positioning set on it, and it's actually set to relative. Unlike relative positioning, the element is taken out of its normal document flow if its positioning is set to absolute. Let's say we have this gray box and it's some kind of a container element and its position is set to relative. And then we have this box number 1, that's the one we're going to target, and some kind of a box number 2, some other element that's number 2. So if we set the position absolute on number 1, what's going to happen is it's going to be, first of all, taken out of its normal document flow. And it's going to remain in the place where it was without any other offsets. So as you can see in this illustration, element 2 moved up underneath element 1. Since element 1 is no longer part of the document flow, element 2 doesn't think it's even there. Now, if we do some offsets, and in this case, we're doing bottom right offsets, we're going to be relative to our container element since that container element's position is set to relative. And we're going to do bottom from bottom 10 pixels and then from right 10 pixels over. And that's how we end up with this number 1 box being in the bottom right of our container element. A really cool feature of this combination is that if your container element is itself offset, everything inside of that container is offset with it. So you could set up a particular layout within a container element and then move that container element or offset it all around the screen without worrying about having to offset particular values of every element within that container element. Let's jump into the code editor and take a look at some examples of these concepts. Okay, so here I am in Sublime Text, and I'm looking at a file called positioningbefore.html, and it's located in the examples lecture 22 folder. So let's examine real quick the structure of the HTML. It's super simple. We just have an h1 just announcing what we're doing here. And we have a div which has an ID container, and then 4 paragraphs, each one having ID P1, P2, P3, P4. And that's it. And our initial styles are pretty simple as well. First of all, we reset the margin and padding, as well as set our box sizing to border box. We also gave the H1, since we're on margin, that familiar light bluish color. And every paragraph tag is 50 pixels by 50 pixels, and it has a border, black border of 1 pixel, and also has a margin bottom of 15 pixels, every single one of them. And every single one of them has just a different color, just to differentiate which one we're looking at. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this looks like in the browser. So as you can see, here's our 4 paragraph boxes, and they're sitting inside this light bluish container, this div container. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to work on this first box right here. And what we will do is we will set its position to relative. And when we do that, save and refresh, we see nothing really happen. Well, actually what's going on here is now we've set an anchor. So now all offsets of this element are going to be relative to its normal document flow position, which still remains right here. Let's go ahead and give it some offsets to simulate it going basically down to the second row. We'll give it top 65, so it's from the top 65 pixels down, and then from the left, 65 pixels from the left. And we'll refresh the page. And here we go. So we move this element from here to here, and as you could see, this element is not taken out of the document flow because the rest of the elements are still sitting in their original spots, and this space is still completely unoccupied. Well, the truth of the matter is the browser is thinking it's actually occupied by this element, which we just moved over here. So that's the basic rundown of your relative positioning. And next, we're going to go over an example of absolute positioning.
Yeah, oh, sorry.
Let's play around a little bit with the absolute positioning. Let's take this third box, which is colored cadet blue, even though to me it looks a little bit green. Let's take that and let's try to set its absolute positioning to move it right back to where the maroon box used to be. So let's go to paragraph 3, and we'll set its position to absolute, and we'll give it a top of 0, and we'll give it a left of 0 as well. And when we save it, let's see what happens when we refresh. And voila, when we refreshed, you could see it was taken out of the regular normal document flow, but it's not quite where we wanted it. We wanted it right here in its original, in the spot where the maroon box used to be, but yet it's flush, right flush with the browser's edges. Now, why is that happening? Well, let's take a look at our document structure one more time to figure that out. This is the box number 3 right here, represented by a paragraph with the ID P3. Well, we remember that absolute positioning needs a relative or an absolute parent or an ancestor. Well, it goes up the chain and says, is this element something that has its position set to either absolute or relative? And the answer is no. So it keeps going, and it goes up to the body element and asks, does this element has an absolute or a relative position set on it? And the answer is no again. So it jumps all the way to the HTML element, which has its position set to relative by default. And that's how we end up with the box going all the way up top. So how do we fix it? Well, simple. We just need to anchor the ancestor or the container of our paragraph tag with the position relative. And any element contained within that container element will then be positioned relative to its edges. In our case, since we want this box to be relative to the containing div element, we need to set the containing div element's position to relative. Let's go ahead and do that. We'll say position relative, we'll save it, we'll refresh, and when we do, it should jump right here where the maroon box used to be, and exactly so it does. Last but not least, let's try to move the entire container element down a few pixels and see if all the containing elements will move exactly in the same position down with it. In order to do that, let's go ahead and go to our div container, and we'll give it a top value of 60 pixels. And once we save, let's refresh, and the entire container moved down together with all its containing elements, and they're all positioned exactly the same as we positioned them before. So in summary, static positioning is default for all elements except HTML. HTML actually has its positioning set to relative. Relative positioning offsets the element relative to its normal document flow position. And the normal document flow is not affected whatsoever by moving or offsetting the relatively positioned element. Absolute positioning is relative to its closest ancestor, which has positioning set to a non-static value, which is either absolute or relative. The important thing to remember about absolute positioning is that the element is taken out of its normal document flow, and the rest of the elements basically behave as if that element doesn't exist. Also, as you saw, offsetting the relative container element offsets its contents as well, which gives you great flexibility to move around a whole set of elements and not just one. Next, we're going to talk about media queries.
In position relative on element text without a regular to equals. アウトオブじゃないんだな。パルス。All elements have their position property set to static. これは true。これでいいのかなあ、true じゃなかった。理解してない。もう一回やろう。もう一回。setting position. Relative element text is a regular sequence flow. アウトじゃない。By default, all HTML elements have their position. そうです。リレーティブ少ないから、なっていると。ここは、
Together and target them to devices.
もうここまで言ったから、とりあえず今日はここまでにするか。うわぁ、いつかも過ぎてる。でも明日まで。今日はここまで。というわけで、HTML はここまで。あとは、どうしようかな。 次は英語の方ですね。こっちも過ぎてるんだよね。21日過ぎてるんだけど、まあ、1日テストやんないと。さて、開始。
Welcome back to Business Communication Skills. Have you written emails before in English? Are you going to be writing emails in English in your jobs or studies in the future? Well, this module is all about email. Love it or hate it, email is a very important part of business communication, and in this module, you'll learn about writing effective and professional emails, how to write subject lines, greetings, and closings, how to choose the appropriate tone, and finally, how to start off and end an email. By the end of this module, you'll be able to write some professional-looking emails, so let's start with the first lesson. Let's start by talking about some useful email tips. How many emails do you get a day? How many of them do you read? How many emails do you send? It's probably more than just one or two, right? We can become swamped by too many emails, so it's a good idea to follow these tips so that we can make email an effective form of communication. Email is fast, but you should take your time writing an email, especially if it's part of your job. Look at this email. It's hard to read, isn't it? Look how we can make it much easier by a few simple steps. So this is what we did. We divided it into short paragraphs. We used white space between the paragraphs. We used bullet points, and we made the sentences shorter. Another thing to remember is that we still use paragraphs in emails, even if they're short. Look at this email. All the sentences are on separate lines. It's actually harder to read. It should be divided into smaller paragraphs like this. Email is not face-to-face communication, and so there's no body language to help the other person understand you. Try to avoid jokes or strong emotional language. Emoticons or emojis might be helpful in some cases, but they aren't considered professional. Also, it's a good idea to avoid overusing exclamation marks. Be clear and specific. Your readers don't have a lot of time to spend reading emails, so the less time they have to spend trying to understand what you're trying to say, the better, right? If you're writing to someone because you want to get a response on a couple of issues, it's much better to write them in separate emails. Why? Because often the reader might just give you a response on the first issue and then forget all about the other ones. It also helps to track separate issues later. Have you ever hit send and then realized you spelled something wrong, or received a reply and seen your original message with a terrible or embarrassing mistake? We all have, but still, it's a good idea to read through the email carefully, especially if you're writing to someone you don't know. Even though it's email, following the rules of written English will make sure the impression you give your reader is a good one. Let's start right at the top by looking at the subject line. First of all, you should always write a subject line. Although we've all sent emails without a subject line, making this part of your final check before hitting send should help you avoid this mistake. Actually, it's a good idea to write the subject line before you write the email. That way you'll never forget. When you check your inbox, although you might look at the name of the sender, you'll also look at the subject line. This will tell you what the email is about and help you decide whether you'll open it. This means that the subject line should be specific to the topic and not vague. If you see the subject line help, you'll know the sender wants help, but help with what? Brochure production help is much more specific. Sometimes, if you're responding to an email and the topic of your email is different, it's a good idea to change the subject line that matches your new topic. Usually, this happens with internal emails among a group of people. Look at some vague subject lines and see how we can change them to be more specific.
どっちがいいかって話や。何についてか。
Another guideline is that the subject line should not be too long. These days, a lot of people check their email on their phones, and only about 25 characters of the subject line are usually visible. This means that we don't usually write sentences, but use short noun phrases instead. How do you think we can improve this subject line?
長すぎるって。How do you think we can improve this service today? 携帯とかで見ることを考えると、アップデータアバウト運動だから十分ってこと。これは長すぎる。
Did you notice that we took out the verb, pronoun, and the article the? Actually, we can make this subject line better. It's a good idea to put the most important word first, so let's see what happens.
今のこれもっと。
Did you notice that by changing the order, we also took out two prepositions, so we made the subject line even shorter? Putting the most important words first also helps if the reader wants to find the email again because the topic of the new retail store is more specific than update. There are just a couple of things about style that are important. First, make sure that you capitalize the first word in the subject line. You can also capitalize the other words, but it's not necessary. We usually don't capitalize prepositions or articles like the or an. Don't use all uppercase. This means that you're shouting and can make the reader angry or not want to open the email. And finally, try to avoid starting the message in the subject line and finishing it in the body of the email. You make the reader have to open the email, and it can be annoying. Let's do a quiz to review what we've learned about subject lines.
We will tell subject lines quiz later. Others, click continue. さて、ではクイズといきます。30分か、練習問題。そういうレベル十分だってことね。Use the best subject line. 標準語っていう部分。全部大文字いらない。Use the best subject line. 優秀な。どうでしょう。端的にわかりやすくことですよね。
Now that you know how to write a good subject line, let's take a look at how to write a greeting in an email. What greeting you use depends, of course, on who you're writing to and your relationship to that person. Let's look at several situations.
こっちやるの忘れてた。いいの。続くっていうか、これも自動にしたいような気が。さて、これで戻そう。 続き。
If you know the name of the person, but you have not Now that you know how to write a good subject line, let's take a look at how to write a greeting in an email. What greeting you use depends, of course, on who you're writing to and your relationship to that person. Let's look at several situations. If you know the name of the person, but you have not met him or her, you can use these greetings. These are more formal. Which greeting is used for a man? Which greeting is used for a woman? Right. Mr. is used for a man and Ms. is used for a woman. If you know the person's name and you want to be a little less formal, you can just use the first name. If you're answering an email and the other person used his or her first name in the closing, you can use the first name in your greeting. However, remember we don't use Mr. or Ms. with a person's first name. Unlike in a letter, we don't need to use dear. It's perfectly okay to use just the person's family name with Mr. or Ms. or the first name. If we want to be a little friendlier to someone we know, like a friend or colleague, we sometimes use hi and the first name. Now, what if you don't know the name of the person you're writing to? The best thing to do is use dear with the position of the person. However, we don't use the company name after dear. We always address an email to a person. If we want to send an email to a group of people, we can use something like this. The last two are more informal. If we don't know the name or even the position of the person, then what we can do is just omit the greeting altogether and just start with the body of the email. What about punctuation? Well, notice that we use a period after Mr. or Ms. At the end of the greeting, we use either a colon, which is more formal, or a comma. Notice that there's no space before the comma or colon. This is the style in American business writing, but in other styles the punctuation might be different. For example, in British English, there's no period after Mr. or Ms., and you don't need any punctuation at the end of the greeting. Let's do another quick quiz to review the guidelines for writing a greeting in email.
We will take a practice quiz next in the lesson. Click continue. ちょっと感じだな。テスト。これ教えられるとなんか言わないでください。テスト。ディアミネはインコレクト。ディアフェクト。こういう風になるわけね。エブリは。レクト。こんなもんでしょう。そうだ。ディアヘクターは不正解。ディアミナキムは、ディアヘクターは不正解。スタギア、ディアメリカ。負け、今ので、の世界は。もう一度試す。ディアミナキムはこれ。これが変ならこっちもこれでいいのか。ミスダイヤをさせて、これ。これもいい。なんかできてるってことかな。いや、ドットだから、コレクター。エブリアンは、これがインコレ。こうか。どうだ。全然上がらない。もう一回。 えーと、言うと思ってると思った。やったんだけど、もう一度。いやで、みんな決むだけでいいから、これはインコレクト。ディアヘクターはこれ。ズダイヤはこれ。同じくディアメで。ディアドットメイン。はい、エブリワン。イッタ、ディアメズ。どうかな。ダメかな。ダメだ。ズダイヤが正解。ディアウェインが正解。というわけで、今回はダメだ。そうだ、もう一回読み直し。というわけで、今回のここはダメなので、いいと。いい。英語できてね。今どこまで進んだ？こう、テラエディクス、ユーダシティ、フリーコーデック。エングリッシュに入れてなかったな。スタート。スをやっと。そうです。Magic 8 You've learned a powerful tool in JavaScript. Control flow. It's so powerful. In fact, that it can be used to tell someone's fortune. In this project, we will build a Magic 8 ball using control flow in JavaScript. The user will input information in our program. 一回今日はここまでにしといて、あとは見ると、ウェブ配信。